is this thick with laws that schools have to obey. And so the argument is, same with fraud, well, you know, we have to do all this accountable stuff, and then some fly-by-night private school is going to spring up, and it's going to be a fake school, and people are going to send their kids there. They don't have to take any tests, and they don't have to do anything that proves that they're getting any kind of good education. There's not parity in that kind of testing. But it goes back to something that Professor Dorfman said at the very beginning. That's the presumption, is that there's a parent out there who wants their child to get a horrible education, that they somehow want to just waste a bunch of money to go to a fake school. I know of very, very few parents who actually would intentionally want to send their kids to get a bad education. That's a very, very unusual behavior. But so again, it goes to the point of, is the government supposed to be the trust giver to say, well, this school is good because it does all these, you know, stack of rules? Or is a parent saying, hey, I see what my kid is learning, I see how they're doing? But at the same time, the bill has protections. The bill says that the schools that take this money have to give what's called a nationally norm reference test, which is a test that's out there in the world that's given all across the country in order to make sure that they're not, you know, as a level of protection. The office basically lets them look at financials and other things to make sure, again, that they're not some sort of fraudulent setup. So we had about 2.5 pages of rules in the legislation that would allow the state to make sure that there was some checks and balances that the schools would have to meet. In fact, ironically, one of my senators, who's a huge school choice proponent, got nervous about the legislation because he was nervous there was actually too many rules in the bill, saying that he didn't want the private schools to have to do a bunch of regulation and things like that. So it always is a little bit of a trade-off, but really it boils down to who's going to make sure there's no fraud. The parent's going to do that 99% of the time. The state can look at other rules, but Professor Dorfman hit it on the head. This is not like there was $1 billion Medicare fraud that was in the paper today about a whole false thing with braces and fake telemedicine doctors. That's $1 billion that the federal government lawsuit would not have ever spent. This is just the same money that would have gone to a school, and so there's really not a way that the government's going to be out a bunch of money.
Yeah, I would add too on this topic that a lot of what you hear about it comes from what happened in Arizona.
Yes.
So Arizona is where the ESA was created. And it was created because, to get back to the difference between a voucher and an ESA, they had a voucher program. The court struck it down because students were using the vouchers at parochial schools. And so the ESA was created to comply with the court ruling there. But that required them to set up a system for how the money got spent, right? This is a new thing. And the way they tried to do it was they gave families that applied for an ESA a debit card. And then they had to turn in receipts for how they spent the money. And most of what's been described as fraud was really just misspending, in that they spent it at a vendor and then that vendor was suddenly, or was later deemed not to be approved. Or they spent it at one type of curriculum provider and that curriculum provider hadn't been approved. But they weren't spending it on trips to Disney World for the most part. I say for the most part only because I don't know. There may have been somebody in Arizona who did that, and I don't want to be told that I lied when I said nobody did it, but I've heard of no one doing it. We can learn from Arizona's mistakes. Other states have already done that. In Florida, you go to a website, it's kind of like Amazon, and the only service providers you can buy from are ones that were approved to be on that website. So you have an amount of money in your account on that site, you can spend it down only with the providers on that site, and you're unable to spend it at Walmart or Disney World or anywhere else. So it's really a lot of times it's an implementation thing. We've learned from the mistakes of other states. We don't need to repeat them, and we almost certainly won't. We may make other mistakes, but we won't make the same ones, and waste and fraud really are overstated concerns that happen to pop up in our public schools from time to time as well, anyway.
Okay, I think that Mr. Dudgeon is correct in saying that almost every parent would be inclined to pick a good school, to pick a fitting school to send their children. But one might say that parents may not have the appropriate information to make that decision for their child. I would probably call that a little bit illiberal with a lowercase l, but what would you say to that? Is there anything that comes with ESAs that would provide that kind of information?
I love this question. One of the things I sometimes write those sports columns about, and in fact I've given whole lectures on, is problems with our welfare system. And many of the problems with our current welfare system have to do with the fact that politicians, mostly liberal Democrat politicians, put in there because they insist that they know better than poor people what poor people need help with, and so they restrict it, right? We don't give people money, we give them an EBT card that they can only use to buy food, and we give them money that they can only use to pay their heating bill, and we give them money that they can only use to pay their rent. And it turns out the problem is their car is broken down, it's going to cost $500 to repair, and if they don't have $500, they're going to lose their jobs because they won't get to work. But they can't spend their food stamp money to fix their car. So they lose their job and they end up costing us more money, right? There is this idea that mostly liberals, I think, seem to have that poor people are stupid as opposed to just being poor and needing some help. This seems like an example of that. The idea that because people aren't, and remember, we're not talking about super poor here, we're, as Cal said, we're really talking about people who weren't able to pay for full-cost private school education without getting a little help. So we're probably talking about anybody up to $100,000 or $150,000 a year in income. We're saying they're not smart enough to choose what's best for their kids, or even to decide how to evaluate whether their kids are doing better in the new situation, right? You might decide as a parent that your kid might be learning a little less in this different non-public school, but at least they're not getting bullied. The education according to reading, writing, and arithmetic might not be quite as good, but they have a great theater arts program, and your kid, that's what they really want to be. So, you know, this idea that the government somehow, or the teachers' unions, or even the school boards, well-meaning as they may be, have a monopoly on wisdom and knowledge in deciding how kids should be educated and how to make the decisions for each kid, seems to me an awfully big stretch when we look around at all the stupid things we see our governments doing all the time.
I will say for the record, I lost a lot of 1-4 votes on the school board yesterday. and I totally agree. You know, it's a deeply philosophical question of do you trust people with their money, or the taxpayer money, or somebody have a better answer? And like I said, even in the bill, we were going to do a little bit of transparency, like you have to publish your norm reference thing, so you could see at least one measure of how the school is doing. But you'd ask the moms at the school bus stop, they'll tell you where the good schools are, they will tell you who the good teachers are. They know. This is not rocket science here. They know that this tutor is great and this tutor is not good. And then, I mean, this is a false premise. And I think it's just really something thrown out there in order to just kind of say, well, you know, people, and it really does get to a philosophical thing where there unfortunately is a class of people in politics who really want to make all the decisions centrally. And it's unfortunate, but it really is a false premise. People know the good schools, they know the good teachers. I'm not worried about them being figured out.
But even if you believed that false premise, even if it were true, that people don't know, they can't go down to the bus stop and ask or whatever, that website that I told you about, where you would go and you would buy from approved vendors, you could have a rating system for those vendors on that website. Think about Amazon. When you go there and you're trying to decide which of these 4 products you're going to buy, you look at the reviews, right? And you you see what other people have thought about those products or those service providers. There's no reason that can't exist. We already have Yelp and all sorts of, there's Great Schools, is that the name of the rating agency? It's already out there. There's information publicly available from the private sector, from the public sector as well. So even if you believe people don't on their own know where they ought to turn when they have this opportunity, there's information available. There are many ways to make it available to them, and so it's really just a very easily resolved problem.
And my last few questions are going to be less about the ins and outs of the policy and more about its potential implementation. First of all, I wanted to know from Mr. Wingfield what he gathers the public thinks about school choice. I think if you were to read the room, there are at least a few of us who would agree with most of what you said. However, I think if you were to say the same things to a DeKalb County Teachers Union, they would probably point out a few problems that they have with it.
That's fair, and I had a feeling you might ask me about that. So, I looked at some poll results, some of them national, some of them Georgia specific. My former employer, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, 2017, asked respondents across the state, would you support or oppose expanding school choice for parents in Georgia? Supporters say expanding school choice offers parents more opportunities for their children. Opponents say it could undercut public school funding. 61% yes, I would support that. 33% no, 6% didn't know. Then, as a follow-up question, would you still support it? So of the 61%, if it meant public tax dollars going to pay for private or religious schools where parents get government-funded school vouchers to pay for tuition. The vast majority of people, almost 70%, stuck with school choice, even when that, I would say, loaded question was directed to them. So that's a general audience from a general circulation newspaper, right? Education Next is an education outfit. Support for publicly funded scholarships to private schools, this is a national result, increased from 45% in 2017 to 54% in 2018. Among parents, 61% support the policy, up from 52% the year before. And that's pretty much across the board. One of our sister think tanks, the Georgia Center for Opportunity, did a poll last year, found 68% of Georgia voters support school choice for families. Republicans, 75% support. Independents, 65% support. Democrats, 62% support. White voters, 66% support. African American voters, 70% support. And these polls, I could go on and on. Every poll I've ever seen about school choice tells the same story. It doesn't matter who you ask. It doesn't matter how you ask it. It doesn't matter how you load the question. It doesn't matter if you're talking about taking money away from public schools or not. People support it because people intuitively get the value of having choice and competition. We have it in every other area of our lives. They get that this is an important thing in education as well, and especially if we're talking about their children's education. And I think this is only going to increase as time goes on, because each succeeding generation has had more choices and more things than the previous generations. And I don't think that our friends in the room who are going to be graduating from college soon and at some point getting married and starting families and all that, I don't think they're going to be less inclined to want choices in those important decisions than those of us who did a lot of those things a long time ago.
So we'll move on from what the people think to what the people who matter think and what they're doing. So where is school choice, and specifically ESAs, what is its status in the state legislature? What are legislators doing to make it happen? What have they done?
That was my life for a good portion of the past couple months. I ran point on this program for Lieutenant Governor Duncan in the Senate. I'll tell you a little story about what happened this year with the legislation. Senate Bill 173 by Senator Greg Dolezal from Forsyth County and others who are supporting it was the ESA legislation this year. And you would think with a state Senate that has 35 Republicans and 21 Democrats, and it's, as Kyle said, it has a 75 to 80% polling with Republican voters, you would think that you would be able to get this legislation passed. However, we did not, and I'll tell you kind of why. A couple reasons. You know, people, when they think about politics all the time, they think about lobbyists, and they think about, you know, big businesses and all this money and these big fat cat corporations, and there's those kind of lobbyists. But the most powerful lobbyists in the state capitol actually are the government lobbyists for the public school teachers, and believe it or not, the cities and the counties. The lobbyists for the county commissions and the city councils are incredibly powerful, and they get a lot of what they want. And so your government lobbyists are really more powerful. And you say, why is that? Well, a lot of your state legislators used to be city councilmen or county commissioners, but also these state legislatures, their wife is a public school teacher, or their aunt, or even gets more thing. If you go into rural Georgia, we have 159 counties in Georgia and over 180 school systems. In many of the rural counties of Georgia, the school system is the largest employer. It is the source of health insurance for a lot of people in the county. And the highest paid person in the county is the school superintendent. The second highest paid is the high school football coach. And the third is the principal, and that causes a little consternation there. You think I'm joking, but I'm not. And so if I'm a state senator from South Georgia and I have 6 or 7 counties and 10 school districts, I've got 70 school board members who are mad as snakes about this bill. And I've got all these people saying, you're going to take all this money away from my schools. That means that we're not going to be able to pay the teachers, and you're going to not get any raises, and we're going to have to cut our arts program. And the lobbyists perpetuate this fear narrative that if this happens, that all these terrible things are going to happen because of money taken away. The irony is that this year, we were doing education savings account. In the same year, we spent $500 million to give the public school teachers a $3,000 raise. But at the same time we're giving them $500 million, there's still, the narrative did not change, and Kyle knows this. The narrative was identical. Anytime you talk about any of this thing, the narrative from the public school establishment is, you're taking money away, you're going to hurt the schools, you're going to cause all these problems. And so basically what you do is it scares a lot of the representatives and the senators because they're scared of their local people. The phrase in politics that all politics is local, from Tip O'Neill's speaker back 30 years ago. A lot of truth in that, and these senators really are afraid that their local school board members and teachers will rebel against them and cause them to lose their seats. I don't know if there's really any evidence that's ever happened, but they believe it's going to happen. And so when we brought this legislation for a vote, it takes 29 votes in the state Senate of Georgia to pass it, and we got 25. We had lots of Republicans. In fact, a couple of the leaders of the Republican caucus in the state legislature voted no or did not vote because, again, they felt all this enormous pressure that the sky was going to fall if this was going to happen. And you wonder, are they being truthful? And here's another weird, perverse fact about lobbying in the state capitol is that if you're a lobbyist, you're trying to justify your professional group or your lobbying contract, you don't want to say, oh, this will probably be okay. You're motivated actually to make the most scary story possible because then your members will pay you to have more lobbyists and more impact and more funds and more things to fight the evil state legislature who's trying to do all these terrible things to you. So there's a natural feedback cycle for them to kind of paint these terrible pictures. And you get people, and honestly, you get teachers who honestly don't know any better, who when they hear these stories, they really are scared. And I feel for them because they're being given a bag of goods. We had in the bill a limitation of 0.5% of the students in Georgia and no more than 2.5% of any kids in any one school system. So the idea that that somehow was going to destroy a school system was just false on its face. But the problem is that the proponents of this are not nearly as loud as the people who don't want it. And because the teachers are such, and the education folks are such a powerful voting group and a powerful speaking group, they really just scared a lot of the legislatures. But if you look at the Republicans who voted no, almost all of them were from rural Georgia, where again, that's the biggest employer, and those people actually carry a big stick. So.
The other half of what you were just saying about rural Georgia is I think they don't think there's a benefit for their constituents. They think, well, I come from a county where there's 300 students in the whole school system, How's a private school going to open? How are they going to take advantage of these options? That's one reason, again, why we as an organization think ESAs are such a powerful tool. Homeschooling is an option no matter where you are. Virtual education is an option no matter where you are. And once again, it's potential to create a new segment in the market with new service providers offering something that hasn't been offered before, could work in those places as well. There are micro schools in different parts of the country where it's 8 to 10 kids, and that's a school. I heard from one of our colleagues in Arizona. He had just gotten back from visiting, I believe it was a Navajo school, funded with $5,000. The kids have ESAs. There's less than 10 students there, but it is a school. They're getting the kind of education their parents wanted for them. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere in Georgia. But it's our duty for those of us who support this to explain that to people, because it's counterintuitive. If you come from a rural area and it's a small school, I understand why you'd think that this wasn't going to help you. But my argument is that it can, and there are examples of it out there.
Well, before I open it up to audience questions, I'll ask the panel if they want to say anything else for the record before we start that.
I just wanted both the senators from this area, Senator Couch again, did vote yes. So I just point that out for this audience.
We had hoped
I
we would get.
double check.
We had invited the local legislators, and we had hoped we would get them here. The University of Georgia scheduled a legislative retreat for today on top of us. So my good friend Toby Carr, the new Vice President of Government Affairs there, I'm going to have a word with Toby. I've had a word with him in Athens many times before, so usually good, but this time we'll have to fuss at him a little bit. But no, I think we're good if we want to open it up to questions.
All right, well, thank you.
I'll try to walk around with the mic, I guess.
Yeah. So. Well, thank you again for answering those questions, and now they'll get to yours.
I think I saw your hand first. Try to get there.
The biggest negative that I always hear about vouchers or these ESAs is that the school systems need to plan. That they let their contracts out in April for the next year, and they've got to know how many kids they're going to be teaching. They've got to know how many teachers to hire. What do you do about that?
So what's amusing about that is the implication that there are no families in that county that between like April or May and August move. I think 3 times during my K through 12 career, right? When do families with kids move? In fact, every family with kids tries to move in the summer. That's why there's a real estate season. Okay, so sure the schools try and plan. In fact, one of the things I'm an expert in is forecasting. I've worked with some school districts on forecasting how many students they're going to have. But people are still moving, like they're not getting it right. You're guessing. This would change the guessing a little bit, but it's not really a game changer.
Well, and a couple other things, as a school board member, you don't know in April exactly what your property tax is going to be, so you actually don't know what that budget's going to be. You also don't know what's called a midterm adjustment. It's kind of technical. The legislature gives you an adjustment in February, March for that school year. There's a lot bigger variables into what the budget is than what this would be, and so that's another, I believe, false flag.
And again, we're talking about half the money per pupil.
That's right.
So, yeah, the other half of the budget is intact. Let's go right here.
But dovetailing on that, isn't it always a year, like it's a year behind, like you do your FTE in October, but your money doesn't come until February, so you readjust in February as to what your per pupil is, isn't that correct?
You do.
So by February, you usually pretty well know what your money is going to be.
Yeah, but you know February for the money that's going to be coming for the rest of that school year.
Yes.
But that's way later than knowing for your school year in April, probably.
Right, and so, but I'm saying that the April issue is kind of a moot issue.
It is a moot issue.
Okay. I'm a public school teacher. I'm retired. I have 37 and a half years in public school. I was a principal at Union Point STEAM Academy when we went to charter, and I've opened helped open 2 charter schools in Georgia. So I want you to know that I am not necessarily anti-pro-choice, but I do have some concerns. One of the concerns I had was that you said I read House Bill 173 and I read House Bill 168, I think that was the revised one. You were talking about a provision where there would be a website where there would be particular service providers. Was that written into either one of those bills? I didn't read it in there, but maybe I missed it.
I'm the one who said that. I was saying that's the kind of thing you could set up. I don't remember whether it was in either of those.
It was not in the legislation. The ability to approve the providers was, and that's just something that would be done by rule or by the agency.
Right. I think what it said is the Department of Education shall establish a way.
That's right. That's right.
All right, so my question to that is then, if we see another bill coming forward, could that be addressed? Because that is a huge issue, is that if we have more accountability in a public school than we do a private or particularly homeschooling, then that is one of the biggest drawbacks as far as what I hear.
I do want to make a point to that,
Okay.
and I'm going to be very honest with you.
We made concession after concession after concession on that bill for points like that. I think I can make 927 concessions. That's not the point. This never going to be agreed to by the public school people, so I appreciate making those concessions, and one of those is actually a good idea, and Kyle saying about a rating website is a great thing to put in future legislation. However, I'm not very optimistic that a lot of times the concessions are used as a delaying tactic in the legislature. It's like, oh, please add this, and you add this. Oh yeah, why don't we add the other thing? And you get right above the vote, oh no, we can't vote yet, but we need to add this thing. And so a lot of time that's used as a delaying tactic.
And I'll say in general, the problem with getting a little too specific on something like that is you don't know what's going to become obsolete. There's always a fine line between the legislature wanting to make sure its intent is implemented, but not over prescribing it to the point where it becomes unworkable. So Monica, let's get a question from you.
Thanks. I'm a temporarily retired charter school superintendent. And I worked in Massachusetts for several years at the dawn of the charter school wars that were fought there. And I recently wrote a book review about the battle for charter schools and education reform in Massachusetts. And it was interesting to me to learn that, well, I mean, I knew because I lived through it, but to actually see the numbers that in Massachusetts, which doesn't have a whole lot of rural school systems, they encountered the same thing you're describing from the school establishment. And their legislature funds the departure of a student from a public school system into a charter school at double, essentially. Over 6 years, they are paying twice as much to educate that student because they reimburse the district for 6 years. It's not all reimbursement every year, but they essentially pay twice as much to educate a public charter school student. But in the most recent referendum to raise the cap on charter schools in Massachusetts, it failed miserably. And the MTA, Massachusetts Teacher Association, and the AFT affiliate waged an extremely successful campaign called Save Our Public Schools, saying that it was draining money, when in fact, school systems were making money. Literally making money off the loss of charter school students. My question is actually for Kyle, because in Massachusetts what happened was you had, quote, outside interests like the Walton Family Foundation and others that heavily funded the pro-charter movement, and the union-backed and school board-backed forces really made a lot of political hay out of that. And there's some arguments in Georgia that you have these outside interests coming in, but are you aware of any kind of movement in our state to combat those kind of arguments?
Stay tuned. That's the short answer. I think that in Georgia, there has to be more of an effort to get people who support policies like that to speak up about it. And I do think there are some folks out there that are going to be working very hard to do that in the very near future. I would point out, though, I always think it's interesting